All right, we're following breaking news now. More than 1,100 former Justice Department prosecutors and other DOJ officials are calling on Attorney General William Barr to resign. The stunning development is in response to Barr's controversial decision to ask for shorter prison sentence for Roger Stone, a longtime Trump advisor. The officials, who served in both Republican and Democratic administrations, signed and released a rare statement today demanding Barr step down as the nation's top law enforcement official. David Shortell is a CNN crime and justice producer, and Tolu Olorunnipa is a White House reporter for The Washington Post and a CNN political analyst. Good to see both of you. All right, David, let me begin with you. What more can you tell us about this statement?
In January 2025, Smith released his final report as special counsel. In that report, he wrote that he stands fully behind his decision to charge Trump and that the admissible evidence would have resulted in a conviction had voters not returned Trump to the White House. The AP covered this extensively, reporting that Smith's findings directly undercut Trump's claims that the cases were politically motivated or based on weak evidence. Smith emphasized that Justice Department policy against prosecuting a sitting president is the only reason the case was ended, not any weakness in the evidence or legal theory. That distinction is absolutely crucial because Trump and his supporters have been claiming for months that the cases were dropped because prosecutors realized they did not have the goods. But Smith is saying, no, we absolutely had the goods. We just cannot prosecute you anymore because you won an election, and DOJ policy says sitting presidents are immune from prosecution. Trump escaped justice not because he was innocent, but because he won enough votes to give himself immunity from criminal prosecution. This is not how the legal system is supposed to work, but that is exactly what happened here. Politico reported on Smith's final findings, and the language Smith used is incredibly direct and damning. He wrote that Trump has not been exonerated for an unprecedented criminal effort to subvert the 2020 election and that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction. Smith then resigned from his position after the case was forced to close because of Trump's election victory. The significance of that language is that not exonerated means Trump did not beat these charges on the merits. He did not prove his innocence. Prosecutors did not conclude they were wrong about him. Instead, the case was stopped for procedural reasons related to Justice Department policy about sitting presidents. Smith wants everyone to know that the evidence against Trump was strong enough to convict. When a prosecutor says evidence is sufficient to sustain a conviction, they are stating this is not a close call or a borderline case. This is a case where the evidence clearly proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and would survive all the legal challenges and appeals that defendants present against convictions. Smith believed he could not only get a guilty verdict from a jury, but that the conviction would hold up through the entire appellate process. That is an incredibly strong statement about the quality of the evidence and the strength of the legal case. It gets even more detailed and damning because Smith did not just write this in a report, he also testified under oath to Congress about his investigations and his findings. The New York Times reported that Congress released a 255-page transcript and nearly 8.5 hours of testimony from Smith's closed-door deposition in late December 2025. In that testimony, Smith told lawmakers that his inquiry uncovered evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump participated in a criminal conspiracy to reverse the 2020 election results and obstruct the legitimate transfer of power. Beyond a reasonable doubt is the highest standard of proof in criminal law. It is what prosecutors have to prove to get a conviction. Smith is stating under oath that he met that standard with the evidence his team gathered. Smith also said that while the decision to bring charges was his as special counsel, the basis for the charges rests entirely with Trump and his conduct as alleged in the indictments returned by grand juries. That is important because it pushes back on the claim that this was Smith acting without authorization or making a political prosecution. Smith is stating grand juries of ordinary citizens looked at the evidence and voted to indict Trump, which means regular people found probable cause to believe Trump committed these crimes. The BBC covered Smith's testimony and report extensively, noting that Smith defended the cases and confirmed he would make the same charging decisions based on the evidence regardless of party. That is significant because one of Trump's main attacks on Smith was that this was a partisan prosecution driven by Democrats who wanted to take down their political opponent. But Smith is saying, look, I am a career prosecutor who has worked under Republican and Democratic administrations. I brought these charges based on evidence and law, not politics. And if a Republican had done the exact same things Trump did, I would have charged them too. Smith's willingness to say this under oath and in his official report shows he is standing by his work and believes history will vindicate his decisions, even though Trump escaped prosecution by winning the called election. This is not someone backing away from the case or admitting mistakes. This is someone stating, I was right to bring these charges. The evidence supported them, and Trump should have been convicted and punished, but was saved by a Justice Department policy that gives sitting presidents immunity. What makes this particularly infuriating for anyone who cares about rule of law and accountability is that Trump did not win the case on the merits. He did not prove he was innocent. He did not show that the charges were baseless. He did not convince anyone that his efforts to overturn the 2020 election were legal or appropriate. Instead, he won an election that gave him immunity from prosecution, which means his political success literally saved him from criminal consequences for conduct that Smith says was clearly criminal. That creates this perverse incentive where someone accused of serious crimes can escape justice by winning enough political power to be above the law. Trump understands this dynamic perfectly, which is why he fought so hard to delay his trials until after the 2024 election. If he could just avoid going to trial before the election, and if he could win the election, then Justice Department policy would protect him from prosecution, even if the evidence against him was overwhelming. That is exactly what happened. Now, the special counsel who investigated him is confirming that the strategy worked. Trump would have been convicted if the case had gone to trial, but he won the election before trial could happen. So he escaped justice. The political implications of Smith's statements are absolutely massive heading into the 2026 midterms, because Democrats now have the special counsel himself stating under oath that Trump committed crimes and would have been convicted if not for winning the presidency. That is about as authoritative a statement as one can get about Trump's criminality. It is not partisan spin. It is not media speculation. It is the prosecutor who actually investigated the case and brought the charges, stating this individual committed crimes, and the evidence proved it beyond a reasonable doubt. Democrats are going to use this in every campaign advertisement and every debate, arguing that Trump is a criminal who escaped justice through political power rather than innocence, and asking voters if they want to give more power to someone who used the presidency to shield himself from criminal accountability. Republicans are going to have to defend Trump against those charges, which means either arguing that Smith is lying or politically biased, or claiming that Trump's conduct was not really that bad, even though a prosecutor says it was clearly criminal. Neither of those is a particularly strong position politically, especially with swing voters who might be open to supporting Republican policies, but are uncomfortable with the idea of a president who committed crimes and escaped prosecution by winning an election. To understand why Smith's statements are so significant, it is crucial to examine the evidence Jack Smith possessed and why he was so confident that Trump would have been convicted. The charges Smith brought against Trump in the January 6th case were conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. These are serious federal felonies that carry potential prison sentences, and Smith brought them based on evidence gathered over months of investigation, including testimony from Trump's own advisors and White House staff, documents showing Trump's knowledge that he lost the election, and a detailed timeline of Trump's efforts to pressure state officials, organize fake elector slates, and pressure Vice President Pence to reject electoral votes. The indictment that Smith obtained from a grand jury laid out this evidence in extensive detail, showing step by step how Trump and his co-conspirators allegedly tried to overturn the 2020 election through multiple illegal schemes. What made Smith confident he could win at trial was the quality and quantity of evidence his team had gathered. This is not about circumstantial evidence or speculation. Smith had testimony from people in the room with Trump who heard him admit he knew he lost the election but wanted to stay in power anyway. Smith had documents showing Trump's lawyers telling him his election fraud claims were false and his schemes were illegal. Smith had testimony from state officials who Trump pressured to find votes or refused to certify results. Smith had evidence of the fake elector plot where Trump's team created fraudulent electoral certificates in 7 states and tried to get Pence to count those fake electors instead of the real ones. All of this evidence was admissible in court, meaning it could be presented to a jury, and Smith believed it was more than enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump committed the charged crimes. When prosecutors say they have evidence sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction, they are stating they can prove every element of every charge to the jury's satisfaction, and the conviction will survive any legal challenges on appeal. That is a high bar, and Smith is saying he cleared it. The congressional testimony Smith gave provides even more detail about his thinking and his investigation. NPR covered the release of Smith's deposition transcript, noting that Smith spent hours answering questions from lawmakers about his evidence, his legal theories, and his charging decisions. Smith explained that his team had gathered evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump participated in a criminal conspiracy, which is legal terminology for stating, "We proved this to the highest standard required in criminal law." Smith also pushed back against suggestions that the charges were rushed or politically timed, explaining that his investigation was thorough and followed proper prosecutorial standards. He said the decision to indict was made based solely on whether the evidence supported the charges and whether prosecution was in the public interest, not based on any political considerations or desire to influence elections. That is important because it undercuts Trump's narrative that this was a Democratic plot to take him down. Smith is stating, no, this was a straightforward criminal case based on evidence that any prosecutor would have brought charges on. One of the most significant aspects of Smith's testimony and report is his discussion of Trump's defenses and why Smith believed they would not succeed at trial. Trump's main legal defense was going to be presidential immunity, the argument that everything he did was part of his official duties as president and therefore protected from prosecution. But Smith's team spent months developing evidence and legal arguments showing that Trump's efforts to overturn the election were private political acts to benefit himself as a candidate, not official presidential duties. The indictment specifically framed Trump's conduct as that of a candidate trying to stay in power rather than a president exercising constitutional authority. Smith believed this framing would allow him to circumvent immunity defenses, and that courts would ultimately agree that pressuring state officials to change election results, organizing fake elector slates, and trying to stop the certification of the election were not official presidential acts protected by immunity. Before the cases were dismissed due to Trump's election victory, Smith was actually winning some of these legal arguments in court, with judges expressing skepticism about Trump's immunity claims and allowing the prosecutions to move forward. The Supreme Court's decision on presidential immunity that came down in summer 2024 complicated Smith's case by expanding the scope of what counts as official acts protected from prosecution. But Smith continued to believe he could win even under that new standard. That is why he filed a superseding indictment that revised some of the charges to make clear they were based on Trump's private conduct rather than official acts. Smith was adapting his case to the new legal landscape created by the Supreme Court's ruling, and he believed the core evidence against Trump was so strong that he could still get a conviction even with enhanced immunity protections. The fact that Smith stood by the case and said he would bring the charges again, even after the immunity ruling, shows he genuinely believed the evidence proved Trump's guilt and that the legal obstacles could be overcome. This was not a prosecutor backing away from a case that became harder. This was a prosecutor stating the case is still solid and Trump would have been convicted if they could have gotten to trial. Smith's report and testimony also address what would have happened after a conviction, and this is where the potential incarceration time comes in. The charges Trump faced carried prison sentences ranging from a few years to potentially decades, depending on the specific counts and how a judge chose to sentence him. Federal sentencing guidelines would have given the judge a range to work with, and the judge would have considered factors like the seriousness of the offense, Trump's criminal history, whether he showed remorse, and the need for deterrence. Given that Trump was a former president trying to overturn a Democratic election, it is very likely a judge would have imposed a significant prison sentence if he had been convicted. This likely means years rather than months of prison time, which would have been an unprecedented situation of a former president going to federal prison for crimes committed while trying to stay in power. Smith believed the evidence was strong enough to get to that point, to get a conviction that would result in Trump being sentenced to prison. But the Justice Department policy against prosecuting sitting presidents meant none of that could happen once Trump won the 2024 election. The classified documents case that Smith also investigated is part of this same story, though Smith's report on that case has not been released yet. A federal judge has ordered that the second volume of Smith's report dealing with the Mar-a-Lago documents investigation remain under seal for now, But Smith has indicated in his public statements that he believes that case was equally strong and that Trump would likely have been convicted there too if prosecution had been allowed to continue. The documents case involved Trump allegedly taking classified national security documents to his resort, refusing to return them when asked, obstructing the government's efforts to recover them, and lying to his lawyers and investigators about what documents he had. That is a more straightforward case in some ways than the January 6th prosecution, because it does not involve the same complex questions about election law and presidential power. It is basically a case about mishandling classified information and obstruction of justice, which are well-established crimes with clear legal standards. Smith apparently believed he had Trump decisively proven guilty on the documents charges as well, which means Trump was potentially facing conviction and prison time in multiple cases, all of which went away when he won the 2024 election. The political context around Smith's investigations and Trump's response is also important for understanding why Smith felt the need to be so definitive in his final report and testimony. Trump and his allies spent months attacking Smith personally, calling him deranged, accusing him of being a Biden operative, claiming the cases were political persecution, and promising that Trump would fire Smith and end the investigations if he won back the presidency. Trump's attacks were designed to undermine Smith's credibility and create the narrative that these were partisan witch hunts rather than legitimate criminal investigations. So when Smith writes in his final report that Trump has not been exonerated and would have been convicted, he is directly rebutting that narrative and making clear that the investigations were thorough, professional, and based on strong evidence. Smith is essentially stating for the historical record that Trump committed crimes. The evidence proved it. And the only reason Trump is not in prison is Justice Department policy, not innocence. That is Smith's legacy and his final word on these cases. He delivered it knowing that Trump's supporters would attack him for it, but believing it was important to put the truth on the record. This situation matters beyond just being another chapter in Trump's legal drama. It raises the fundamental question of what it means for the rule of law when someone can escape criminal prosecution by winning enough political power to be above the law. The Justice Department policy that prohibits prosecuting a sitting president exists for legitimate reasons. The idea is that criminal prosecution could interfere with the president's ability to do their job, and that the proper remedy for presidential misconduct is impeachment by Congress rather than criminal prosecution. But that policy creates a huge loophole that Trump exploited. If you commit crimes and then win the presidency before being tried, you escape prosecution entirely during your term. If your crimes involve trying to stay in power and overturn elections, then the very conduct you are being prosecuted for is what enables you to escape prosecution by winning the next election. That is a fundamentally broken system because it creates incentives for people accused of serious crimes to seek political power, specifically to avoid criminal accountability. This is not how justice is supposed to work in a democracy. Jack Smith's statements put this problem in stark relief because he is stating Trump would have been convicted, not might have been convicted, or possibly could have been convicted, but would have been convicted if the case had gone to trial. That level of prosecutorial confidence, combined with the fact that Trump escaped those consequences purely through winning an election, highlights how the current system allows powerful people to be above the law. It raises urgent questions about whether Justice Department policy needs to change to close this loophole. Should sitting presidents really be immune from prosecution, even for serious crimes like trying to overturn elections? Should there be exceptions to the policy for particularly egregious conduct? Should presidents be subject to